Well, a very pleasant day to everybody who's joining the Viking.TV program on how planes fly. My name is Lou Thieblemont. I'm the Viking resident astronomer. And you may well ask, what's the astronomer doing talking about airplanes? Well, maybe as you can see, I was an airline pilot for almost 40 years and had a great time flying all over the world. And now I sail all over the world with Viking and have a lot of fun giving talks on my favorite hobby, astronomy. And of course, I take you flying when we're at different cities to give you an idea of what goes on in the cockpit, you may well ask. So let's get going. Let's see. So, as it says here, did you ever wonder while you're sipping that martini in first class how the plane really flies? We have to go back to this fellow, Daniel Bernoulli. Daniel was a resident of Switzerland. His father, his brothers, they were all mathematicians. And one of the things he said would be better for the true physics if there were no mathematicians on Earth. But Daniel Bernoulli was very famous for coming up with a formula that said when the velocity of fluid increases, the pressure and temperature decrease. And that's very important. That was one of the basic things we were taught in aviation school about the fluid mechanics of how lift is created. He wrote a wonderful book called Hydrodynamica, and it was very, very heavy duty. But the real thrust of it is that when a fluid, and air is a fluid, when it starts to move faster, the pressure around it tends to decrease. So what you have here is a tube, and let's call this a Venturi effect, like a carburetor on a car, an old car. Most cars don't have carburetors anymore. But here you go from left to right as the velocity of the fluid hits that narrow spot. It increases in speed to get through, and you can see the two probes there with the yellow arrows, that the pressure actually decreased in that area. So that is one of the fundamentals of how lift is created. And here's another look at it in an animation of the particles you see moving from left to right. As they reach that pinch point, they move faster, and then they slow down when they get to the other side. So that was one of the important things that Bernoulli did. Here's another animation of it just to show you that as the velocity of the air gets squeezed in, it goes faster through that narrow opening, and then it slows down again. That's one of the important things about how a wing works on an airplane. Now here's a animation again of on the left the pressure indicators and on the right the velocity. Air will move faster over the top of the wing than under the bottom, and at first we were taught that the molecules of air that separated at the leading edge of the wing would meet up at the trailing edge of the wing, and that is not true at all. It has nothing to do with that at all. It has to do with something very complicated. So lift, this is part of the explanation. Let's get into it because it gets a little bit complicated. Here we have a truck at the top that is stationary, and you see that the tarpaulin is flat. But as the truck is rolling down the road, the trapped air inside the tarpaulin, inside the box of the truck, gets pushed up or bulges outward because the fluid or the air going over the top has a lower pressure. And that is very much what's going on with the Bernoulli principle. Another thing you could do as you're going down the road, if you pass a large truck with your car, you get to squeeze the air in between the car and the truck, and the pressure decreases there. And not so much are you going to notice this in a car, but you will certainly notice it if you're on a motorcycle, where it will actually start to pull you toward the truck. So you have to be very careful with that. Now here is a famous thing called a Bernoulli blower. You see the ping pong ball there in the bottom of the picture, and as the air is going around the ping pong ball, what happens is the ball is smooth and it is kept in this low pressure. And I can demonstrate that to you because I happen to have a hairdryer here, as if I really need a hairdryer. I'm going to turn it on, and I'm going to introduce a ping pong ball into the flow. It's going to get a little noisy for a second, but watch what happens. Here's the ping pong ball. And you notice how it stays in that column of air. I can even tilt it one way or the other. And the Bernoulli principle says that the fluid moving around fast creates a low pressure that traps that ball in there. If I take a crumpled piece of paper and try to put it in that flow of air, watch what happens. It won't stay. It won't stay because it's not smooth. That's the important part of this demonstration. To get the ball to stay in there, it needs to be trapped with that fluid flowing around it. Here's some more illustrations of that. You can see on the left, the three balls are kind of staying in that column of air that's coming out of the blower. And on the right, the fellow is blowing into a cup with a straw, and that velocity of air coming out creates a low pressure, and you see it pick the balloon right up out of the cup. So these are all parts of Bernoulli's principle. And if you've ever had an umbrella out on a windy day, and Bernoulli's principle is very well demonstrated by it wrapping the balloon or the air, pulling the umbrella apart, and it rats to you, Daniel Bernoulli. There it is. But there's more to it than that. So let's talk about some of the other people. You all might remember a fellow by the name of Newton. He had some very, very interesting things that I find very much in this talk. So a closer examination is definitely required. We're going to have to talk a little bit about a mathematical aerodynamic description. Yes, caution, we're going to have some math here just for a second. Yeah, very scary, I know. Be careful, it's not that big a deal. Yes, oh, please don't get excited about it. This is the formula I'm going to talk about. Don't cry, it's not that big a deal. It'll be easy. Look, we're going to say that lift equals 1/2 of the air density times the velocity squared times the surface area times the coefficient of lift. You see, that was easy, wasn't it? Wasn't that hard? Yeah. Well, it's not really that easy to understand what's happening on a wing. This is a nice diagram of it to show you the wing form with an angle of attack. That red wing is not level with the airflow, but it's got a pitch to it. And you see the airflow around the top of the wing goes faster, and the airflow underneath the wing gets sort of squished together, and that's the high pressure on the bottom and the low pressure on the top. And that's a very simple example of what's going on here with the wing. Philippe Spilart, a NASA scientist, said it's easy to explain how a rocket works, but explaining how a wing works takes a rocket scientist. So let's go to Mr. Isaac Newton and talk about some of his laws that really apply to what we're talking about here. The three great laws, I call them. So the first law is that every object at rest stays at rest. An object in motion stays in motion unless it's influenced by an outside force. Okay, that's good. I like that one. Then we have another second law, which basically is force equals mass times acceleration. So if you have a force and you increase the mass, you're going to get more force, or if you increase the acceleration, you'll get more force. So that's going to work for us talking about a wing. So that's the second law. And the third law is for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And that also will be shown how the wing works today. But let's talk a little bit closer about the second law in action. Here is a diagram showing force equals mass times acceleration. You see the red over the top moves faster than the black under the bottom. That creates a low pressure, and we get lift from that. And this is a diagram of what it looks like in animation. You notice the dark blue at the bottom is the high pressure air. And then right at the leading edge and even slightly below it, that air, because of that high pressure, tends to want to go over the top of the wing, and it moves a lot faster. And there you have the lift. The lighter color at the top is the low pressure. The heavy dark blue at the bottom is the high pressure. That's one of the things that makes lift. But it's really more complicated than that. I'll break it down. I'm not going to get too far into this because it does get a little weird. But let's say that cube is a molecule of air. And it wants to go, as we first heard from Newton on his first law, that an object in motion stays in motion unless it's acted upon by an outside force. And in this case, the outside force is this curvature of the wing. So we look here, we see this vector, the blue arrow going out, and it wants to go straight. But the curved streamline wants to pull that molecule of air to follow the curve of the wing, and that is what gives you a low pressure on the top, and we'll examine that in a few more ways that may be a little bit easier to understand. So here we have a centripetal force. We have a rope tying a ball, let's say, going around, you're spinning it around your head, and you cut the string or you let go of it, the ball will then take off in a straight line. And I can show you that better in this animation. Here we have this ball, we cut it, off it goes in a straight line. And that's important because that centripetal force is this force we're talking about that's bending the air molecules down to the shape of the wing. So we have the wing shape, we have this bend or fluid bend that tends to accelerate to the inside of the curve, creating a pressure gradient with high pressure on the outside of the curve. And then we get that area of lift, low pressure. And this is a very simple diagram because it is much more complicated than that. So force equals mass times acceleration. And you can see that in this diagram pretty well. You see the lift at the top and the pressure, higher pressure in green at the bottom, pushing the wing up. So those are the three laws of Newton. Let's see the third law in action. And that is the lift deflection. So you have the third law talking about for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. The air that hits the wing and is forced down, or the air that's going over the top of the wing and is also forced down, gives you an equal and opposite reaction force. What we used to do when I was a presenter in our science museum is we would take one of those little car dollies that you'd get under, crawl underneath the car, you'd lie down, and it has wheels on it. So we would put somebody on that, let's say a young man, and give him a bag full of rocks. And we'd say, we want you to throw the rocks away from you. And when they do that, they push the rocks away from them. They actually go backwards with an equal and opposite reaction to the force it took to push the rocks away. And that is exactly what's happening here. So there's the three laws of Newton. And here you see a column of air. And as the wing goes through it, look what happens. The column above is affected dramatically, pulled down. That's the lift going up, and pulled backwards, whereas the lower one is pushed down and forward. And that's what's happening in a wing as it goes through. And I have some more animations to show you that. And here's just a static diagram showing you the effect looking from left to right. The column on the left is not affected, and then it starts to get affected by the wing. And as it moves through, you see what happens to the column of air as the wing goes through it. And there are some other forces to talk about. There is the Magnus force, named after Gustav Magnus, who was a German physicist, and the Coanda effect, named after Henri Coanda from Romania. And these are two interesting forces that work on a wing as well, something to talk about. The Magnus force is interesting because if you've ever watched a soccer game, you are watching the Magnus force, and I will show you that. Here we have a cylinder, the top picture with the green cylinder rotating as the arrows show, but moving through the air from right to left. And when that happens, the top part of this little green sphere has the low pressure, and it tends to move in that direction. The air is moving faster because the ball is spinning in that direction, and that pulls the molecules apart and creates a low pressure at the top. On the ship, what I do is I have this roll of toilet paper, just a cardboard piece, and I'll wrap a rubber band around it enough that I have some spin, and I pull it out and fire or let go of that cardboard tube. And what it does is, because it's spinning backwards as it's moving forward, it goes up in the air dramatically, and that is the Magnus force. And I can show you some more examples of that. Let's look, for instance, at what can happen with the baseball. When the pitcher throws the ball, he puts spin on it, and the ball changes direction. Let me go a real picture here, the same guy, and watch as the guy swings and misses because the ball descended because he had spin on it. Same thing with a soccer ball. When you kick it with a lot of spin, the Magnus force takes place and pulls the ball dramatically around, as you can see here in this animation. And another way to show you this is I drop a basketball from a high dam about 600 feet and just drop it with no spin. The ball falls almost directly straight down. But if you put backspin on it, watch what happens to the basketball. It takes off and heads down the river with a little backspin. So that is the Magnus force. Another diagram of it showing as the ball is spinning, the molecules are separated, pulled apart. You have high pressure on the bottom, low pressure on the top. The Coanda effect, well, what's happening here is this fluid, in this case the air, wants to stay with that curve. And he was very good at diagramming this and showing it. And you see at the bottom, the one on the bottom, the angle of attack, as we call it, is too great, and the air can no longer stay laminar to the surface of the wing, and it separates, and that's called an aerodynamic stall. And we'll talk about that and show you some pictures of that. So here's the Coanda effect. Notice in a smoke tunnel how the air tends to want to stay with that curve as the wing is being pitched at about a 15-degree angle of attack. Look at that. That air just stays right with it, and there's the low pressure on top, high pressure on the bottom. When you have too much angle of attack, in this case probably about 25 degrees, you see that the air can no longer stay laminar to the surface of the wing, and you get this aerodynamic stall. And here is a picture showing all the effects. You have the Bernoulli effect there, because as the pilot in this F-18 is pulling G's, that air is extremely fast over the wing, pressure and temperature decreasing. You also have the Coanda effect showing how that air just stays with the wing shape, and it shows you a lot of the stuff happening over the wing by condensation. Now here's a picture of a 757 that I used to fly, and you notice the nose wheel is just coming off the ground, off the runway, and already on the wing you see that there's a fog starting to form. Now I'm going to animate this and show you what happens when the pitch increases. Watch how the fog increases. You can see you notice the difference there. Look how much lift is being created, and that's the Coanda effect, and that's the Bernoulli effect in action, showing you right there. Another way to show this is if you have a stream of water, nice and smooth, and you introduce that spoon into the stream, it will want to follow the curved end of the spoon and bend the stream of water. And I'm sure you've all had that happen to you when you try to pour water out of a pitcher and you see the water run down along the pitcher. This is all part of this wanting to stick to the surface, the Coanda effect, the stickiness of the fluid. But why should a fluid follow a curved surface, really? Why? Well, the answer is viscosity. That is the flow wants to stay with that shape. It's a sort of stickiness. No, not that kind of stickiness. No, a different kind of stickiness. See, the viscosity in the air is very small, but it is enough for the air molecule to want to stick to the surface, the shape of the surface, and the relative velocity between the surface and the nearest air molecule is exactly 0. But as you go up a little bit, just a little bit, the molecules start to bend in this shape of the wing, and the farther you get from the surface, the faster the fluid is moving until the external velocity is reached. Looks something like this. The molecule that's right on the surface isn't going to move, but as you move up just a little bit, you see as it tilts over and starts to follow the shape of the wing. And because the fluid near the surface has a change in velocity, meaning a bend, a change in velocity, the fluid flow is bent toward the surface. Unless the bend is too tight, as we showed you, the fluid will follow that surface. This volume of air around the wing that appears to be partially stuck to the wing is called the boundary layer. So the primary force of lift on an airplane wing is Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration. And here's a great diagram. Start on the left, look at the column of black dots. As it even approaches the wing, it's being bent already. And watch the dots that separate at the leading edge. They never join up again. And you can see that the air is really affected way above the wing and way below the wing. And that is what makes the wing fly. That's a great diagram of it. Notice how fast that little black dot is moving across the top of the wing compared to the bottom. And here's an example of what happens as an airplane is flying. The high pressure air on the bottom of the wing wants to be in the skinny, thin air on the top of the wing, and it wants to roll around the edges. And you can see that in these vortexes that have created. Here's another beautiful shot. As the wing flew through that cloud, there are two wingtip vortices that are created, and you can see the high pressure air at the tip wants to be up on the top because that's the low pressure, and that's what you get. There's another example of it showing as we take off, all of a sudden you get these little vortexes that are created by the lift wanting to be exchanged. High pressure on the bottom wants to be with the low pressure on the top. Here's another example. You have two there. You have the large one, which is formed by the wing, and then the little one, the little narrow one, is formed by the flap itself. Two vortexes on each side. Some really good pictures of what happens with lift. And there, as the airplane touches down, you see the tremendous area that's affected by these wingtip vortices. And that's why it's so important for pilots to understand not to fly too close behind another airplane, because you could have a lot of problems with something like that. So airplanes are separated by several miles in trail. So in order to stop this, what air manufacturers have learned is they put what they call a blended wingtip or a fence. So on the picture with the red vortex, you see it's quite large, and that's a lot of drag. That's a lot of wasted lift. And you see with the blended wingtip, when you look on the right side with the little green vortex, that's a lot less drag. And we can save a lot of fuel with these blended wingtips. It makes quite a difference. It also makes the turbulence behind the airplane a lot smaller. So air has power. Yes, it does. And you can see that here. And if you have a wet-mouthed dog, you will notice that even more, that air has power. And anyone who's ever put your hand outside the car as you're driving and change the angle of attack of your hand, you can feel that the air exerts a considerable force on your hand. The amount of force depends on, of course, the speed of the automobile or the speed of the onrushing air and the change in angle of attack of your hand. This diagram shows a zero angle of attack on the top picture, and then 5 degrees and 10 degrees. And you can see how the lift changes, how much more lift is created for any different angle of attack. Of course, if you get the angle of attack too steep, then the fluid can't stay flowing on the wing and you get an aerodynamic stall. And here's just another animation showing how the lift changes as you change the angle of attack. So let's examine how we control the airplane. Uh-oh, this does not look like it's going to go well. Oh, no. Uh-oh, I see a crash coming. Yep. Now, this is a pilot's eye view of the forces on an airplane. You have the money to pull it forward, the FAA to drag you back, reality pulls you down, and dreams take you up. But that's really not the four forces on an airplane. No, this is what they are. Thrust and drag, lift and weight. Those are the four forces on an airplane. We also have the three axes of flight. You have roll, pitch, and yaw. The roll axis is a line that goes through from the front of the airplane to the back, and you can roll left and right around that axis. The pitch axis goes through the center of lift of the wing, and you can pitch up, nose down, up, changing altitude. And then the yaw axis goes right down through the middle, and that's left and right. And that's all controlled with different parts of the controls, and I'll show you each one. So in the cockpit of a little Cessna here, you see that the lower right picture, I have moved the yoke or the wheel off to the left for a left turn. And in the upper picture on the upper left, you see that the left aileron is up and the right aileron is down. So with the left aileron up, that deflects the air, Newton's third law, pushes that wing down. The one that's on the right pushes the wing up, and you roll to the left. You turn to the left. Same thing is true on a big airplane. You just have more controls. You have two ailerons on a 747, inboard and outboard. And the same thing happens when you move the control wheel. You roll the airplane by changing the angle of the air going off the wing. Here are the two ailerons on the right wing are down. They would push that wing up. Now, an interesting thing is a thing called adverse yaw. And what happens is The aileron that goes down goes into that fat air, that heavy air that has all the molecules in it. The aileron that goes up goes into the skinny air. So when you want to make a left turn and you put the right aileron down, it's going into the fat area. It actually pulls the nose to the right. So you have to adjust for that. It's called adverse yaw. And the way Mr. Boeing did it here is he adds a little bit of spoiler on that side to counteract that adverse yaw. When the ailerons are up, you get a little spoiler in there, and that keeps the nose from moving left or right. In a Cessna, you have to use your feet. And speaking of feet, we'll talk about banking here in a second. Oh, not that kind of banking. Yeah, this kind of banking, when we bank the airplane. See, when you bank the airplane, you lose lift. The reason for that is that the lift is always perpendicular to the wing. Let me have another diagram here to show you. Here's the lift, always perpendicular to the wing. And in this case, the lift is equal to the weight, and it's balanced. The airplane remains level. But when you bank the airplane or turn it, you are using some of that lift to turn the airplane. And you notice that we have lost a piece of our lift enough that the airplane would start to descend. So the way you make up for that is to add more lift by pulling back or add some power or a combination of both to make up for the loss of lift in a turn. The greater the bank angle, the more you lose the lift. The pitch axis is normally controlled back in the empennage or tail area of the airplane. There are some airplanes that have the elevator in the front, and that's a little different. That's called a canard. But here for the standard airplane, you can see that the elevator, which is painted red in this case, is attached to a horizontal stabilizer. And what happens is when you pull back on the yoke or the wheel in the airplane, the elevator, as you see here, goes up. The air is deflected up. That pushes the tail down. That pushes the nose up. Does that make sense? Yes, I think it does. And conversely, if you push forward on the yoke, the elevator goes down, higher pressure underneath, pushes the tail up, the nose goes down. Absolutely the same thing in a 747, only the elevator is really big, and you have 4 of them, 4 different hydraulic systems to run it. Yaw, that's the axis where you turn left and right, or yaw the airplane left and right, is controlled by these foot pedals. They're down there at the blue arrow. And if you push on the left pedal, what happens is the rudder moves to the left, creates a high pressure on the left side, pushes the tail to the right, pushes the nose to the left. That's yaw. Same thing happens in a 747. 747 has a huge rudder, and there are actually 2 of them, 2 separate rudders that are powered by multiple hydraulic sources. But that's roll, pitch, and yaw. Now, flaps in a Cessna are very, very smooth. You see how they come out of the wing and tilt down. What they're doing there is creating a high pressure under the wing and also creating more of a curve to the wing. So you get more lift, but you also get drag. And that's a good thing for when you have to land in a small runway, short runway, you have to come over an obstacle like some trees. You use the flaps to make more lift and slow you down so you can come down with a little steeper descent. Well, if you're in a big airplane like a 747, you have big flaps. You also have leading edge flaps in the front of the wing. This changes the camber or curve of the wing, makes the wing more curved, makes the lift greater, and also makes the drag. So flaps on the 747 are completely different in a way from the little Cessna because you have those leading edge devices. And here's a look at the leading edge devices from the front of the airplane, and you can also see the trailing edge flaps at the back. Makes more lift, makes more drag. Here's a diagram of a wing, the top one, all retracted, nice and neat, best efficiency for climbing, cruising, and descent. When you want to have a little more lift for takeoff, you put the little bit of the leading edge device out in the front and some flap in the back, and that increases the size of the wing and the camber, gives you a little more lift at a slower speed. For landing, the top picture shows the leading edge device way out in the front and the flaps really tilted down. A lot of lift there, a lot of drag. And once you touch down, you notice in the bottom picture that spoiler comes up. That kills the lift. And now the weight of the airplane is pushed down onto the wheels, so you get better braking efficiency. And it also slows you down. Let's look at some types of jet engines. This is what we call a turbojet non-fan, or a straight pipe, as we used to call it. You have, from left to right, the air is being sucked in by a compressor, multi-stage, up to 15 stages. The air gets squeezed tighter and tighter until it reaches the center of the engine, where there is fuel and ignition added, and the air expands so quickly in this diffuser area that the air runs out the back of the engine through turbines. The turbines turn the compressor, and you have a self-running operation. That's called a turbojet non-fan. And an airplane that might have been seen on was something like this, and 707 back in the early days, where there's no fan, just turbojet engine, and you see the air is pulled in through the front, squeezed down, and expands through the back, turns the turbine, and it turns itself. A little more later, modern engine was a turbojet fan. So here you have a turbojet again, but a big fan blade attached to the front, but everything is enclosed in a cowling. So this was what made it a little more efficient, better thrust for takeoff and climb, and a little more efficient on the fuel burn. Type of airplane that might have had that, 727. You don't see it, but that is a fan blade in the front that's completely enclosed by a cowling. So it's very efficient. And then later on, you have these huge high bypass turbojet engines where the big fan in the front sucks the air in, goes around the engine and comes out the back as cold air. And then the processed air goes through the compressor and goes through the igniters and the turbine. And that comes out really fast, that red line coming out the back. And what happens here is that slower fan air and cooler air tends to quiet the engine down and make it more friendly towards the people that have to listen to this noise. And here's a look at an airplane that might have had something like that, a high bypass turbojet engine. You see that whole area, the white area in the cowling, all that air comes out around the engine. It's not processed at all. That big fan pushes the fan air through, but the compressor and the turbines actually do the work inside the engine, comes out that cone area in the back. Here's another look at it, broken apart so you can see inside. So here you can see a mechanic standing up in the engine checking the fan blades. There's nothing stopping that. You can just turn that compressor by hand. And sometimes when the wind is blowing gently, you can hear the blades just clink, click, 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 click as they're going around in what we call a windmill. So he's up there checking the blades to make sure there's no cracks or dents or stuff like that. Very easy to do because it's so big you can climb right up into it. It also has a wonderful area so you can take a nap in it. And I don't know if Mr. Dyson ever saw this, but it also is a great vacuum. You have to be very careful because you can see what it can do. It can suck up a whole container of luggage. That was not a good day for that pilot, I can tell you that. Now let's talk a little bit about reverse thrust. Now we don't reverse the engines. What we do is deflect the thrust. Much as if you had a garden hose in your hand and you put your hand in front of it, you're deflecting the water, you can feel the thrust change. Or if you're in a bathroom and you have the hand dryer, you can move your hands around and you feel that air, you can feel it blowing in your face. That's what's happening here. You're deflecting the air, not reversing the engine, but reversing the air. And in this diagram here, these pictures, all the ones on the left are the old school engines where you reverse the whole engine. And the ones on the right, we're only reversing the fan. This was a lot easier on the engine doing it that way. But you can see what they did. They actually cut off where the air could go out the back, and it was deflected towards the front at about a 30-degree angle. Here's another diagram of it. The red ones on the top are the old school where you closed off all the thrust coming out the back, and you could actually back the airplane up very easily with that. And the lower ones, you can see what's happening is you're just deflecting the fan air in the front. Works pretty well. And how it's deployed is very simple from the cockpit. You get about 25 to 30% of a reduction in thrust, and you get a vector force that gives you that braking action, which really helps slow the airplane down. And you can see in this diagram, you're just reversing that fan air in the front. In the cockpit, you see these controls, the throttles with the white on them. That's the throttles. The little levers up in the front are the reverse levers, and where I'm pointing to with the arrow, the green arrow, shows that we're in forward thrust. You see in those little, it's hard to see, but right up in the top part, it just says EPR. And when you start to lift the reverser handles up in the front, those little ones, you lift them up to the interlock, then you notice that it changes to REV, and it's in amber because it's going through a stage where it has to go through an interlock and get into reverse. Once it gets into reverse, then the handles are released, and then you can start to pull up on them, and the little REV turns to green from amber. And now you can pull, the more you pull up on those levers, the more reverse thrust you get. And here is a max thrust, max reverse thrust, and you're getting about 30% efficiency to slow the airplane down. That's thrust reverse. And here's what it looks like as an airplane is in reverse after landing. You can see how the air is being moved forward and to the side. That gives you that reverse thrust. GPS. People want to know, how does GPS work? Well, a lot of planes have GPS, and all of you that have phones have GPS in them. And it's a very simple system, but it's a very, very tight calculation. So what we have is a GPS satellite that's broadcasting a time signal. And it knows when it left the satellite, and when the receiver receives it, it is able to interpolate the time it took from when it left the satellite to when it's received by you. So if this was the case and you only had one satellite, you're somewhere on this great sphere. That's not much help, is it? Well, let's put another satellite in there. Now we're receiving two satellites. Both of those spheres intersect, and where the signal is on that black circle, that is where it says you are. Well, that's not much help either, because that's a pretty big area. But if we add the third one, the third satellite, that's called trilateration, now there's only 2 points where all three spheres intersect. One of them's out in space, the other one's on the planet, and it knows we're on the planet, so that's where you are. Now, 3 is a minimum to get this trilateration. There are a constellation of maybe 24 to 33 of these satellites that are running around. You only need 3, but usually you can get 5, 6, 7, or 8 at a time. So you get a very precise location using your phone, or in the airplane using GPS. The airlines don't like to use GPS as a primary because they don't run it. It's run by the military. And if they ever decided to turn it off or stuff, we'd be stuck without it. So we have something else that we use, and I'll explain it. Here is what we have for landing. This is the Instrument Landing System, or ILS. You see you have a horizontal beam that's yellow and blue, light blue. That's left and right. That's called a localizer. And then you notice that that beam is bent down toward the runway. That's called the glide slope. And then there's a dark blue outer marker and a yellow inner marker or middle marker. And this is comprised of the whole ILS system for landing an airplane when you can't see in the fog or the rain. So you have a runway for the instrument landing system. And at the far end, we produce this localizer, which is a beam that gives you left and right of center. And then right at the area where you want to touch down, we create what they call a glide slope, which is usually somewhere between 2.5, 3 degrees. That's your glide slope to bring you down to the runway. And those two items are what you need, left and right, up and down. Then we add in these marker beacons that help tell you where you are on the approach. And it's displayed on an instrument like this in a small airplane. The yellow bar is the localizer. You see that it's off to the left. And on the edges of you might see the glide slope pointers are two, looks like two squares of white. That's the glide slope up and down. But in a modern jet, you have something that looks like this, and you have the localizer at the bottom showing actual runway, green runway with the dots, and then the glide slope is on the right, showing the glide slope right on and the dots above or below. And it shows you what mode you're in by saying glide slope and localizer at the top of the instrument. So that's very important. For visual approaches, whether it's day or night, we have two different kinds of approach help with lighting. We have what they call a PAPI, or a precision approach path indicator, or a VASI, visual approach slope indicator. They both do the same job, but the more prevalent one today is the PAPI, 4 lights in a row. As you can see in the picture, 2 are white, 2 are red. If they're all white, you're too high. If they're all red, you're too low, and you want 2 and 2. That would make it perfect. And there's a picture at the bottom showing how the layout is. Works very well. The VASI does the same thing. Different display, that's the only thing. So I wanted to talk about what the airlines do. We decided that we wanted our own system for navigation, and they decided to put the thing called INS, Inertial Navigation System. That happened back, MIT boys figured that out after World War II, and the airlines adopted it in the late 60s. And what it does is, as you're sitting at the gate, there's a very sensitive accelerometers that sense the rotation of the Earth. And from that, they know where east is. So it's a simple calculation, 90 degrees, that tells you where north is. They also know the rotational speed of the planet, because if you're at the equator, it's about 1,000 miles an hour. And if you're at the pole, it's 0. So it's a simple mathematical calculation to find your latitude. The only thing that it didn't have that you needed to give it was longitude, which is time. This was a big problem for navigation when the English gave the navigation prize back in the late 1600s, because they were losing so many ships, because a pendulum doesn't work on a ship. They had to come up with a different system. So when we were at the gate, we turned this system on. We put in the gate position down to the second, and once it knows its position, including what time it is, it can keep track of where it's moving around, and that gives us wonderful, precise navigation that's completely self-contained in the airplane. And that's the same kind of a system they use to go to the moon, inertial navigation. It creates a platform, and from that we can navigate anywhere we want to go. So this comes to the end of the show. I hope you have some questions, because we're going to have a lot of fun trying to answer them. Here is a couple of pictures just to keep you occupied while you think about questions for me. Here's a great picture. Look at this. Up he goes. So that is the end of the talk, and I'm willing to take some questions. My co-pilot has been very, really very serious writing down all the questions, so I'm sure she'll have lots of questions for me. Right, Heather?
Thank you, Lou. Yes, indeed. So our first question tonight comes from Miki in Montclair. She's one of our regular viewers, and she asks, do all pilots have the same level of knowledge as you about how airplanes work?
I would say yes, because your life depends on it. When I first started flying, I was about 14 years old, and I learned from a good instructor who taught me some of the basics. And interestingly, I grew up in New York City, so when I got my pilot's license, I couldn't drive a car, because you had to be 18 in New York to drive a car. But I had to have somebody drive me out to the airport so I could take them for a ride in the airplane. And yes, I think most pilots, you get very serious about learning everything you can, because your life depends on it. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Lou. Linked to that, a question here from Marta in Altadena, and she says, how long did it take you to train to become a pilot, and was it something you had always wanted to do?
Well, it is something I wanted to do as a kid, and same with astronomy. I was into astronomy. I loved astronomy. But in flying, I got a friend on a block that I lived on who had his own airplane. He took me for a ride in it and let me fly it a little bit, while it was in the air. And boy, I was hooked. I love that. And that got me interested in it. So I started taking flying lessons and read every book I could about it. But it takes a long time. It's a difference between a student pilot, a private pilot, a commercial pilot, and an airline pilot. You have to build up your time. And by the time you become an airline pilot, you probably already have something like 2,000 to 3,000 hours, and you have an instrument rating. And in my case, I also had an instructor rating. So that's how you build up your time. Before the airlines will even talk to you, you have to have quite a bit of time. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Question here from Bill. He's in Lake Oswego, and he says, what effect does hot or cold air have on control?
Well, the hotter the air is, the less dense it is. And I can give you an example. Many times sitting out in Las Vegas, when it was too hot to take off, we'd have to wait until the sun went down a little bit so the temperature would be within the legal limits of the airplane that we're certified under. So if it's too hot, you have less molecules, you'd have to go faster through the air to get the lift necessary, and that would be unsafe. Colder air is more dense, but then when it gets too cold, you have to be careful, like we're up in altitude, you have a temperature that you can't get below because that makes the metal very brittle. So you have a nice little Goldilocks area where you try to fly, and it's quite a big area, by the way, but still, it makes it hard to fly when it's very hot.
Perfect, thank you, Lou. A question here from Janelle. She's in Kent in the United States, and she asks, is there a weight limit for all planes?
Yes, there is a weight limit. It's calculated very carefully. The smaller the airplane, the more critical it is. But in the airline industry, what they've decided to do is use a average weight, a winter weight, and a summer weight. Winter weight meaning you have more clothing, you're a little bit heavier. And they use an average weight because the airplane is not quite as critical. The fuel is the big load on the airplane, and of course the luggage, the baggage. So that's all calculated. It has to be balanced so that you have the center of gravity correct. And then you figure out your weight before you even leave the gate to see if you're legal. And there are times when you'd have to, maybe on a smaller airplane, like a commuter plane, you might have to either take luggage off or take some passengers off if it's too heavy, depending on the temperatures and the runway and the elevation and all of that stuff. So yes, it's very critical to do the calculations and maintain a safe limit with the airplane.
Thank you. Dorothy in Wales in the United Kingdom asks, how often do pilots have their performance monitored using flight simulators?
Well, that's a good question, because you get basically watched every flight you do, because there's a recorder watching you. And of course, the passengers can either tell you that was a good landing or not. Oh, that's one way. But every 6 months, you would have what they call an instrument check. And that can be done in an airplane or in the simulator, generally done in the simulator because it's a lot cheaper. And then every year you have what they call recurrent training, an annual flight review, where you go to classroom and you have a test, and then you get in the simulator and you get another test. So it's twice a year for captain. And I enjoyed it a lot. It was fun. And I was a flight instructor myself, so I had to also go on the planes and teach people to, how to fly the airplane. And also in the simulator, I was a simulator instructor. So it was really quite interesting to me. And the simulators at the time have unbelievably increased in the realism. Just in the last 30 years, it's unbelievable.
Wonderful, thank you. Question here from Andrew. He's in San Diego, and he says, despite all the advances in aeronautics, why can't today's planes fly faster, closer to the speed of sound, over 600 miles per hour? He says planes 50 years ago flew at roughly the same speed as the latest jet planes do today.
Well, that's a good question, yes, because when I started flying back in the 60s in a 727, we flew at about a cruise speed of Mach 85, 86, 86% of the speed of sound. But that was burning a lot of fuel. Fuel was pennies then, 15 cents a gallon, maybe something like that. As we've moved forward in time, fuel has gotten more expensive. The fuel has to be cleaner. The engines have gotten more efficient, but the wings are different. And they found out the sweet spot is a much lower speed, somewhere around 78% of the speed of sound, roughly. When you get up near the speed of sound, things start happening to the airplane, and you end up with what we call Mach buffet, and a noise that would drive the people nuts, the shock of the sound breaking wave. So that's why the Concorde never flew over the United States. It could only fly over the ocean, and it had quite a footprint of noise as it did that. So yeah, it was it was a different time. Fuel was cheaper. Now fuel's very expensive. So we want to conserve fuel as best we can and also make it cleaner so the engines are hopefully cleaner and quieter. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Lou. Question here from Ida. She's in Cambridge in the United Kingdom, and she says, I saw that it was recently announced there would be a non-stop flight from London to Sydney taking around 20 hours. Can you tell us how this has become possible, how planes are now able to carry enough fuel to cover such a distance? And she says, I guess there would also need to be 2 or even 3 pilots swapping shifts on a journey of that length.
Yes, very good question indeed. The longest flight I used to fly was New York to Cairo or New York to Tel Aviv, and coming back westbound, it could be 15 hours at times. And we had 2 crews on there. You had usually a captain and 3 co-pilots, or 2 captains, 2 co-pilots, some mix of that. And for the 20-hour, I'm not sure exactly what the requirements are, but I'm sure it's 2 full crews. And yes, the airplanes have gotten more fuel efficient. Some of the bigger airplanes, the Airbuses, and some of the new Boeings can fly easily the 20-hour legs. To me, the big thing is the passengers. You're up at altitude for a long time. You're got a cabin altitude of maybe 8,000 or 9,000 feet, 8,000 feet at least, very dry, and that will wear you out pretty good. So that's kind of one of the things I think about for a long flight. So if you're going to do that, you need to hydrate, you need to drink a lot of water, lay off the liquor because all that does is dry you out. And if you're sitting in coach in a narrow seat for 20 hours, I'm sure you'll have some issues when you get off the airplane. But anyway, yeah, we could fly even more than that if they had to. But that's a pretty good, to me, that's a long flight. I wouldn't want to do anything like that. I hope that answers your question.
Perfect, thank you. We've got Werner here in Stafford Township in the United States, and he asks, when you were working as a pilot, which were your favorite airports for takeoff and landing?
Ooh, that's a good, I like that one. There were several that I really enjoyed. One of my favorites was the old downtown airport in Washington, D.C., which had a river approach. And in the 727 and later in the 757, that was fun because you actually hand flew the airplane all the way down, and you had to stay in the middle of the river, and you had to be quiet, not make a lot of noise because you're in a very populated area. That was a fun approach. Another one was the Canarsie approach coming into Kennedy Airport, which came over from the ocean and came across the edge of Brooklyn and made a right-hand turn into the 2 runways using a VOR, so there was no precision in it. It was all hand flying and looking out the window. It's kind of fun. I like that. Certain airports in the world are very sophisticated. Paris is very sophisticated. Of course, London. I used to love to fly into Milan in northern Italy, mainly because I knew at the end of the flight the food was really good. Some of the airports that were really tough to fly into, busy, Chicago, Atlanta, places like that, very busy, and you had to pay attention. It wasn't a fun sightseeing. You really had to stay on your toes. I hope that answers your question.
Wonderful, thank you. Question here from Bill. He's in Lake Oswego, another one from him. He says, how do you determine the angle of the wing flaps to get enough lift for the plane to take off?
Well, again, that's done when we do the flight planning and we figure out how much the airplane weighs. We know the altitude of the airport. We know the pitch of the runway or the angle of the runway. And if it's snowing or if the wind is blowing and different, we have all these calculations we take in to figure out what we're going to use for thrust and what we're going to use for flaps. Generally speaking, that is all done right there on paperwork before we even leave the gate. And it's a complicated bunch of calculations, but the thing that's interesting is you end up with a lot of room for error. The airplane has a lot more capability when you do it right. And we can use what we call V1, VR, V2. V1 is what we call the takeoff safety speed. We know the length of the runway, we know the pitch of the runway, the wind direction, whether it's raining or not. And we take that all into consideration and we figure out a speed that we can accelerate to. And if something happens, like we blow a tire or lose an engine before that speed, we have enough runway left to stop the airplane. and they don't even consider the reverse thrusters. They just consider the spoilers and the brakes, the wheel brakes. After this V1 speed, velocity 1 or takeoff safety speed, it's much better to take off because you're not going to be able to stop in the remaining runway. So you take off and you fly what they call an engine out procedure. So all that is done on paperwork way before you even start the taxi. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Lee. We've got a few people here. We've got Carol in the United States and also Joan in the United States. They're asking, can you describe the phenomenon of wind shear?
Sure. Wind shear is something that was not known until sometime in the jet age. What happens is it's wind from different directions. So let's say you have a wind coming from the west, and then at a different altitude, but very close to it, a wind coming from a different direction, let's say 90 degrees, or it could even be 180 degrees, a wind shear, a wind shifting. So you're climbing out, that would affect you, and it becomes turbulent. You lose lift, apparently, depending on how great the shear is. But where it's most important is when you're landing and taking off. So if you have a wind shear, you want to be alert for that. You want to be notified of that, of course, which we do. All the airports that use major airlines have what they call wind shear monitors around the perimeter of the airport. And one of the big producers of wind shear is what they call a collapsing thunderstorm, where when the beginning of a thunderstorm, you have a lot of lift. The air is moving upward. It's warm. It's pulling the air upward. All that moisture is being pulled up, and you get these big clouds. And that's the beginning stage. Then you have the mature stage where the thunderstorm gets real big, and it sometimes produces hail and lots of wind. And then it sort of runs out of steam. It runs out of lift. And then that whole column starts to collapse down. Now think of this as a real big cylinder of air coming down. And when it hits the ground, it can't go any further. So it spreads out in every direction. That is where the wind shear comes from. So if you're on approach and you have a collapsing column of air ahead of you, the first thing you're going to notice is a headwind shear. In other words, you're going to get more lift all of a sudden because the airspeed is increasing from this air blowing toward you. But as you move forward into this column of air, it's going to push you down. And then as you exit the column of air, you're going to get a negative wind shear or a decreasing wind shear. And that's where it's very critical, very dangerous. We have to pay a lot of attention to that. And it's very important that we do that. So we learned that early on, and the technology is getting better and better. Most of the jet airlines today, using the inertial guidance, can monitor the wind as you're flying and tell you whether there's a wind shear. And also the tower will tell you if there's a wind shear. So I hope that answers your question. A little bit technical, but I hope it does.
Perfect, thank you. We've got a question from Bob here. He's in Austin in the United States, and Bob and his wife Carol, I think, met you on board sailing from Barcelona to Bergen.
Excellent.
He says it was great to see you at work again. So Bob says he used to also work for an airline in the 70s and 80s in operations based out of a small airport in Austin. And he asks, what type of commercial aircraft did you fly?
Well, good to talk to you again. It was a fun time. I hope you enjoyed it. We enjoyed it. I started off on the 727 as a flight engineer, and then a short time later moved over to the 707 as a flight engineer, and then came back as a co-pilot on the 727, and then moved up to engineer on the 747, and then came back as a co-pilot and the captain on the 727, became an instructor, worked in the simulator and in the airplane. And then later on, when the 7576 came in, I moved up to that, and I ended my career as a pilot on the 767, 757. The 757 was by far my favorite airplane. It was a wonderful airplane to fly. It could do anything. Wonderful power, easy to fly, wonderful instruments. I hope I see you on another Viking cruise soon. Enjoy.
Thank you, Lou. Question here from Stanton. He's in Wellfleet in the United States, and he says, can you give us any insight into the relationship between pilot and co-pilot? How are the duties divided during a flight?
Well, at TWA, an American, what we did was the co-pilot basically is fully trained, and the only reason he's not the captain is seniority. That's generally the way it works. And what happens is we get to meet each other when we first show up for the flight. And a big airline, you might never fly with the same person again, but at TWA was a smaller airline, so we got to know each other. And you decide, might say to the co-pilot, what legs do you want to fly? Do you have any preference? And we would trade legs back and forth. If he flew the first leg, I would do all the computer work and the radio work, and then we'd swap on the next leg, and I would fly, and he would do the same thing. And we'd go back and forth. And the main thing was to give the co-pilot as much practice as you can, so that by the time he upgraded to captain, he was fully experienced in all the different regimes that happen in an airplane. And that's how we end up bringing up what we call bringing up the rank, getting him trained properly, and a lot of fun that way. It was really great because we worked together. We knew that our job was very critical. If I gave a command, I didn't have to worry if it would be followed because it was so critical. The same thing with the cabin crew. We all worked together. We wanted to know everything working. If it's not, let us know. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We've got David now. He's in Durwood in the United States, and he asks, over the course of your career, were you ever required to make an emergency landing?
Not really. I've had a couple of times where I've had to shut engines down. One of the worst times I had was we picked up an airplane in Milan, a 767, that had a problem with the reverser after it landed. They couldn't get it to close. That happens occasionally. It's a hydraulic system that opens and closes the reverser slide. So what the procedure was to open the cowling, see what they could do. If they couldn't, they would put it in forward thrust and pin it, put a pin in so it wouldn't move. And then they would put a notification up in the cockpit, and then they would safety wire that reverse thrust lever so you wouldn't use it. And we knew about it, and it was not a big deal. So on this flight, we take off from Milan, summer day, hot, fully loaded, climb out. 8.5 hours later, we're coming in over Rhode Island, and we're talking to Kennedy Approach. And they said, you're leading the pack, keep your speed up. You're number one for Kennedy. Okay, great. Sounds good to me. So we're flying, and I was the co-pilot at the time, and the captain in the left seat had been my instructor when I checked out. So we knew each other very well, and we're flying along on this descent into Kennedy, and a little light comes on the panel. It says reverse isolation. And we looked at each other. Well, we have a little library sitting next to us. I opened the book, and there's 2 sentences in there about this reverse isolation light. And it says it comes on to hold the engine in forward thrust because the engine's trying to go into reverse. That's interesting. That's all it said. So the engine was still running. Everything was fine. I put the book back. I no sooner did that than there was a big bang. And we had a second pilot sitting in the jump seat, and I yelled to him to go back and check what happened to the left engine. And he came back and he said, the cowling is gone. The whole cowling departed the airplane. Now, it went under the wing, not over the wing. Had it gone over the wing, somebody else would be doing this talk today, not me. But it did some damage. And I can tell you, when I made the PA announcement to the people, everybody listened. And what we did was we made an approach down an unused runway at Kennedy so the mechanics could go out with binoculars and look at what they could tell us. And they said, yeah, we see a few things, but it looks like everything should work. So the first thing we need to land is the landing gear. We put that down. That worked. And we put the flaps out gently, and they all worked. We made a normal landing. And we shut the engine down after we landed and taxied to the gate. And yep, there was some damage, but everything worked. So that was about the most excitement I've had. And that's enough excitement, I think. What do you think?
For sure. That sounds like enough excitement. And we have a couple of other questions about emergency situations. I've got Marianne here asking, what happens when lightning strikes a plane? And also Joan in the United States asking, can you describe what occurs when birds get sucked into the turbine?
Okay, for the first question, lightning. It is rare that lightning actually hits the airplane. What happens is the airplane usually discharges to the cloud, because as you're moving through the atmosphere, through those electrons get stripped off, and you build up a charge on the airplane, much like in the wintertime walking across a carpet and grabbing the doorknob and getting a little shock. So what you have is on the wing trailing edges, all of them, you have these little tiny wires that stick out, and what they're trying to do is bleed the charge off. So if lightning did strike the airplane, which I've been struck a few times, generally it doesn't do much damage. It could make a mark, it could blow a few rivets out, or it could, what's more important, could damage the radios or the electronics. That would be bad. But what's more likely is that the airplane builds up a charge and it discharges to the cloud, and that's just as exciting. Let me tell you, you get a big bang, it's so loud. And one time we were flying in a 707 up at high altitude. We're flying through the tops of the clouds, which are ice crystals. They're not raindrops, they're actually frozen little crystals. And that gives you a pretty good charge. And we noticed what we call St. Elmo's fire on the edges of the window. And then we got this big bang, a discharge to the cloud, and a ball of plasma entered into the cockpit like the size of a basketball, and it slowly went down through the cockpit door, down the aisle of the airplane, and exited at the tail at about the speed that somebody would jog at. That was pretty exciting, let me tell you. And we talked to the passengers about it, and don't touch it, don't, just let it go, because it is actually a little ball of plasma. Plasma is something that is a proton without the electron. It's a fourth state of matter. You have solids, liquids, and gases, and plasma is where the electrons are stripped, and it's very powerful. That's what's actually inside the sun. That's how the sun works. So yeah, that's most of it. To go to the second question about birds, one time in a 727, I was going into Kansas City, Missouri, in a snowstorm. It was not a heavy snowstorm, but it was, light. And we're coming up on 500 feet. We're starting to see the ground. And the 727 has three pilots, pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer. I was the captain, and I'm hand flying the airplane, watching the instruments. And I hear the engineer say, "Duck." Now, what do you do when somebody says that? Do you duck? Well, no, we looked out the window, and there were 5 Canada geese. We took 2 of them on the windshield right in front of us. One of them went up into the center engine and took the engine out, completely gone. And another one, or 2, went into the wing and damaged the wing. But here I am at 500 feet. I'm landing configuration. The gear is down. I just landed, told the tower we had some bird strikes. And I'll never forget this. As we taxied off the runway to the gate, as you pull into the gate, there's a fellow on the ground with the wands directing you into the gate. And if you can imagine this, he's given us these directions, and all of a sudden he kind of stops, freezes, and he's looking with his mouth wide open at the blood dripping out of the wing of the airplane. So yeah, it was pretty exciting. That airplane had to go for some maintenance for a while. But those are the only instances I've had hitting birds, and they were pretty good sized birds, much like what poor Sully had to deal with his hitting those geese as he took off out of LaGuardia. I hope that answers your question.
A couple more questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
We've got Janelle in Kent in the United States, and she asks, where and how is a plane weighed?
Well, there's several ways to do it. When the manufacturer makes the airplane, of course, they weigh the airplane. They know what it weighs. And there are periodic checks that are done where the airplane is put onto scales, 3 scales, one for the nose wheel, one for each main. Or in the 747, it's a little more complicated. And you can weigh the airplane. The cargo airplanes that I used to fly, the 707, had scales built into the hydraulic system. So you could weigh the airplane as you taxi it out. You would taxi a little bit and stop the airplane, and then it would weigh itself. So that was one way to do it. But generally what we know, we have several known numbers. We have what they call the EOW, empty operating weight, the weight of the airplane with no passengers, no cargo, no fuel. And then we have what we call the zero fuel weight. That's the weight of the cargo and the passengers, but not the fuel. And that's the one we want to know, because that's the only number that's going to change. When we add the fuel to the airplane, as we burn it, the airplane gets lighter. Now, we're not going to throw people or cargo out, so that's the only number that changes, and that's the number that we use, the zero fuel weight, to calculate all our calculations for takeoff and landing. I hope that answered it.
Thank you, Lou. Now we've got Jerry in the United States, and he asks, what actually causes a sonic boom?
Okay, what happens is you get the speed of the wing approaching the speed of sound. The speed of sound is about 1,100 feet per second, or 600, depending on the temperature, 610, 630 miles an hour. I had a T6 for a long time. I did air shows, and that had a big engine in the front, two-bladed propeller, and the tip of the propeller would actually break the speed of sound on takeoff. It's very loud, and it's annoying, and it's also inefficient because now you have this airflow that's disturbed right at the wingtip. So we learned very carefully how to change the speed of the propeller, just enough to keep it under that. So what happens is, as the air is accelerated over the wing, as you approach the speed of sound, the shock wave separates and actually becomes this sonic boom as you go through this very critical area. And the airlines that we fly are not designed to do that. You don't want to do that. In a 727, as you're flying, let's say at Mach 8, 8.8, 8.9, sometimes 9.0, you have parts of the wing that are actually becoming supersonic because of this acceleration of the air over the wing. It's inefficient and it's noisy, and you can't break the speed of sound with any of the jets I ever flew. Does that answer your question?
Perfect. Thank you, Lee. William in Los Angeles asks, well, first of all, he says, thank you for a very interesting presentation. And he says, why did they stop letting passengers listen to air traffic control? He says a lot of the frequent flyers really enjoyed listening to it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I enjoyed it too. I guess they had a couple of things. They had a couple of embarrassing moments, maybe, that didn't want the passengers to hear, maybe. But yeah, I remember doing that for years. We had a channel that you could listen to, and some of the airplanes for a while had a camera that was mounted up on the tail, so you could see what, the airplane configuration and watch where it was flying over. I have no idea why they stopped it. Who knows? I thought it was great, and I would love to see that again.
Thank you, Lee. And then just a quick question here from Margaret in Lagrange, and she asks, do you still fly for fun now?
I can fly for fun. I had an airplane up until just a few years ago. In fact, I owned a little airport not far from where I live, a little grass strip. I had a three-seat Piper Cub, a J5. Loved it. Had a lot of fun with it. But now what I do, because I'm usually cruising around with Viking and enjoying that even more, I have a high-end flight simulator. You might have seen the picture that's behind me. I'm not sure what you're seeing right now, but that is the cockpit of a Boeing 757. Very, very high-end. Everything works just like the airplane. The only thing I don't have is a seat that moves like the airplane, but I can practice, I can fly approaches, I can change the weather, the wind, the load of the airplane, and really have a good time keeping my my flight qualifications up, but not legally. As I'm pretty old now, it would be probably impossible for me to get what they call a first-class medical, but second or third-class medical, yeah, I could fly. I could probably do that. Or there are some airplanes that you can fly that are in the sport category that don't require a pilot's license. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Lee. That's great. And then one last one for tonight, if that's okay. And it comes from Howard in the United States. So he is looking to the future, just to finish on, and he says, what obstacles do you foresee in future acceptance of passenger aircraft flown by ground-based pilots or automatic onboard systems?
Well, yeah, I don't have a Tesla, but my neighbor does, and it has an autopilot, and I've been in it. It's interesting. I guess that could happen. I don't see right now the technology there with the airplanes that are built, but down the road, yeah, I think you look at Mr. Musk, what he's doing with his rockets. For years as a kid, I watched the space program where they would throw the booster rockets and everything into the ocean, and now he brings them back and lands them autonomously on a moving barge. I think that's pretty cool. So I think, yeah, down the road, something could happen. But the bottom line is, and we all probably know this because we've all played with computers, you know that nothing can go wrong, go wrong, go wrong. And when it does, you probably want the human up there to try to fix it for you. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. It's been a pleasure talking to all of you. I hope that I see you on a Viking cruise. We love to have you. We love the questions. And I'm also the Viking resident astronomer, but I also try to bring along my flight simulator and have some fun with people in the Star Theater, showing them the cockpit and flying around from one place to another where we really are on the cruise. So enjoy your time. I hope I see you on a Viking cruise in the future. Thank you very much.